Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's with real pleasure that on behalf of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities of the University of East Anglia, I welcome you to the second event in our series, The Stories of the Gloucester Shipwreck, Norfolk's Mary Rose. You are most welcome. My name is Professor Claire Jowett, and I'm the historical lead on the university's work, the Gloucester Wreck Project, and I'm the curator of this year's series. At UEA, we want to share our research, what we're doing, with the widest range of communities and have conversations about important debates or new discoveries. And in June 2022, the discovery of the Gloucester warship off the coast of Great Yarmouth, wrecked while carrying the future King of England and Scotland in 1682, was announced to the world. The shipwreck is recognised as perhaps, we think it is, the most significant historic maritime discovery since the discovery of the Mary Rose in 1971, and UEA have been collaborating with the finders, Julian and Lincoln Barnwell, and with James, tiny little, he's not tiny at all, since 2019, and with Norfolk Museum Service to share information about the wreck and its discovery with you in our inaugural exhibition about the Gloucester, the last voyage of the Gloucester, Norfolk's Royal Shipwreck, 1682. And I hope that you've all had a chance to see it. It's on till the 10th of September if you haven't as yet. The Gloucester 1682 Charitable Trust has also recently been established to care for the wreck of the Gloucester, with the ultimate goal being to create a permanent home for the artefacts planned to be in Great Yarmouth. We're delighted too that our partnership with Norfolk Museum Service enables us to host this annual series at Norfolk Castle Museum and Art Gallery. Before I introduce the speakers, a little housekeeping, please. There will be, for those in the room, there will be, and welcome to our guests online, of course. Sadly, this doesn't apply to you, but there will be free drinks in the rotunda following the event. The plan is our two speakers will speak for about 25 minutes, and then there will be about half an hour for you to ask as many questions as you want within that time, and then please, over drinks, ask some more. We will also be taking questions from our online audience. And I just also want to take the opportunity to publicise the third event in our series on the 20th of June, which is Shipwrecks and the Sea in Early Modern Art and Culture, New Horizons and Watery Graves. So please join us on the 20th of June. I'm going to move on to today's session. An avoidable tragedy, the Duke of York politics and naval policy. As you'll know, I'm sure, the Gloucester story is centrally concerned with the 17th century navy, a major tragedy involving an argument over navigation. And in our exhibition, we ask visitors to consider who was most responsible for the ship's loss. The pilot who advocated the coastal route, safe but slower. The ship's officers who advocated the deep sea route, again safe but slower. Or the Duke of York, a man in a hurry wanting to get to Scotland to pick up his pregnant wife and return to London, who advocated the middle course. Or is it just a freak accident, nobody's fault? Whatever we think now, and you are asked to judge in our exhibition, to think about who is most responsible, there were two courts-martial in 1682 to determine blame, one against the pilot and one against one of the fleet's officers. So today, this evening, we are going to laser in on the context for those events with two exceptional scholars of naval history. Both are leading proponents of the new naval history, a field which examines through the prism of naval affairs issues of national identity, imperialism, the social and cultural realities of life in ships and on naval bases, the interrelationships between ship and shore, amongst many other things. Their work extends understanding of both the operations and the political, social, economic, and cultural history of the 17th century, a period when both naval infrastructure and supply lines rapidly developed under a series of naval reforms. Naval history is central to British history and to our island story, and they are both scholars that encourage us to think about naval history as big history. And I am absolutely thrilled and delighted to welcome our first speaker, Dr. J.D. Davis, David Davis, and the title of his talk tonight is The Exclusion Crisis, the State of the Navy and the Fate of the Gloucester. But before I invite him to come up and speak to you, I just want to tell you a little bit about him. David is chairman of the Society for Nautical Research and a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, as well as being a prize-winning and best-selling author. He really does have two strings to his bow. He specialises principally in the history of the Royal Navy from 1650 to 1700. He wrote a book, Pepys's Navy, a really seminal book, Ships, Men and Warfare, 1649 to 89, and that won the Samuel Pepys Prize. His latest non-fiction book, Kings of the Sea, Charles II, James II and the Royal Navy, won the Anderson Prize, as well as receiving a Certificate of Merit for the Mountbatten Prize. He really is, an extraordinarily fantastic writer. The second string to his bow is naval fiction. Set in the 17th century, the journals of Matthew Quinton are described by the Times as a series of real panache, and I have read them, and I agree with that. And he also has published a trilogy set in the Tudor period, and is now working on a new series set in the French Revolutionary War, with the first title, Sailor of Liberty, having been published in January 2023. So without further ado, let me please welcome David to come and talk to us about Pepys No More.
Thank you very much indeed, Claire. The problem with an introduction like that is I'm now going to live up to it, but there we go. Pepys No More is a bit of a double meaning, as I hope will become evident during my talk tonight. The subtitle, as you can see, The Exclusion Crisis, the State of the Navy and the Fate of the Gloucester. And I want to spend the time I've got trying to link those three things. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the exclusion crisis, what it was, why it came about, and how that fits in with the voyage of the Gloucester, and very much then the state of the Navy in relation to our friend Mr. Pepys, who is going to play quite a big part in this story. So, in 1678, there was a huge conspiracy theory, and we are well used to those these days. But in 1678, there seemed to be a lot of foundation for it. The idea that the Jesuits and various hangers-on were trying to assassinate King Charles II. The reason being to put his brother, James, who was a known Catholic, he'd converted a few years earlier, on the throne in his place. And this rapidly escalated. It escalated into a kind of a hysteria that, again, we are very used to. In these days, would be played out largely on Twitter. But in those days, they killed people for it. And it became a major, major political crisis that really rocked King Charles II and the state that he reigned over. Why was there a popish plot? Let me hope it comes up. Well, we need to understand, to explain this hysteria and the kind of reaction there was to this alleged conspiracy, we need to think about a bit of context over about the previous 100, 150 years. You go through English history in that period and you can go back to Queen Mary's reign in the middle of the 16th century, which of course is associated very much with what you see there, the burning of Protestant martyrs. You can move on about 50 years and you come to the very familiar still Gunpowder Plot. This was all becoming very ingrained in the national psyche through the 17th century. Rather less well known, 1641, the Irish Rebellion, massacres of Protestants in Ireland by Catholics. I like this piece of propaganda because there we've got the famous babies on bayonets trope, a long time before it's applied to the Germans in Belgium in 1914. But it just shows that this sort of propaganda imagery has been around for a very, very long time. And then most recently, of course, we're talking, as I say, about the late 1670s here, the most recent thing that was within people's living memory, or far more people's living memory. You can't see it very well there, unfortunately, with the lighting that we've got, but that is the Great Fire of London. And although we may know that the Great Fire of London started accidentally in a baker's shop in Pudding Lane, at the time people were absolutely convinced that it was a Catholic plot. And if you go to the monument in the City of London and read the inscription on the monument, it basically still tells you that it was a Catholic plot. So we have all of this background, and we have, as I say, a state of virtual national hysteria. What it leads to, among other things, is the removal of these two gentlemen from having any role in the Navy. Now, James, on the left, in his rather fetching Roman uniform, which I'm not sure if he ever actually wore in real life, but there we go. James had ceased to be Lord High Admiral of England in 1673, when his Catholicism meant that he had to resign. But he had continued to have a great influence on naval affairs. And for example, we know that when the Admiralty Commission met in the 1670s, even when he wasn't necessarily listed as a member, he was there and he could be driving the agenda. The main official loss at this particular time, we're talking about the spring of 1679, was the man on the right, who was, of course, Samuel Pepys. Now, Samuel Pepys, most people know just as a very jolly diarist and somebody who had some rather interesting scrapes, particularly with women, and was, in some respects, a fairly disreputable individual. But Pepys, in the day job, was a naval administrator. He was a very good naval administrator. He'd been the clerk of the Acts of the Navy Board, and then from 1673 to 79, he'd been the secretary to the Admiralty. But in 79, he is so associated with the Duke of York that Pepys is forced out of office, and he is indeed even sent to the Tower of London. This brings in a new Admiralty Commission consisting primarily of opposition parliamentarians, some of them who are absolutely out-and-out believers in the Popish plot, and advocates of what happened next, in a way, which was the exclusion crisis from 1679 to roughly 81, 82. because the consequence, the logical consequence, as far as many people were concerned, of the suspicion that James was a Catholic, therefore he was associated with all that historical baggage about murder and massacre and mayhem, and the idea that he couldn't be trusted on the throne, that led to a project to exclude him from the succession. Remember that Charles II had no legitimate children. I stress the word legitimate because if you know anything about Charles, you know that he had absolutely no trouble fathering children at all. But none of them were legitimate. James was therefore the next heir. He was 3 years younger than Charles. He is sent into exile, or effective exile, in Edinburgh, basically ruling it as a viceroy. And there you've got the Palace of Holyrood House, which was his base while he was up there. And of course, this explains the voyage of the Gloucester, why she is making that voyage through that sea area at that particular time. James had been in Scotland for the best part of 3 years. He's made a quick trip back to England to see his brother. It's all been okayed for him to come back properly and so on. So he's going back up to bring down, as Claire has said, his wife, Mary of Modena. And Claire also mentioned that she was pregnant. Let's just stop for a moment and think about the significance of that in relation to what I've just said. Because Charles has no legitimate children, James is the next heir. Who are James's heirs? Who is James's male heir? He hasn't got one. He has two 20-something daughters. If this child that Mary of Modena was carrying, and she's 5 or 6 months pregnant at the time, if that child was a boy and it lived, it would become king. So that's how high the stakes are. That's why James is in this absolute hurry to get back, to bring her safely back down again. So after the exclusion crisis, after these 2 or 3 years where everything has been about 3 successive parliaments trying to exclude James from the throne, that threat is finally subsiding in the spring of 1682. And what could be a firmer sign that James is the next in the order of succession and his line will then continue after him than the birth of a male heir to James in that particular year. So the context of this is very, very important. Now, as I say, that's very much the idea of the Popish plot and the exclusion crisis. I now want to turn to my second theme, the state of the Navy. And I want to link the fate of the Gloucester to the fate of this ship, which is the second-rate Henry. A much bigger ship than the Gloucester. The Henry was a second-rate. She was a very prestigious warship indeed. 10 days, and only 10 days, after the loss of the Gloucester, the Henry blew up at its moorings in Chatham Dockyard. Now, to paraphrase Oscar Wilde, to lose one ship would be a misfortune. To lose 2 looks very much like carelessness. And it does raise the question, well, if you've got 2 such enormous casualties in such short order, is there something seriously wrong with the state of the Navy at that particular time? And there does seem to be, at first sight, quite a lot of evidence to support this. The vast majority of that evidence comes from our old friend, Mr. Samuel Pepys. This is the cover of his only published work. The diary, remember, was never published in his lifetime, nor were any of his other works. This book was the only book that he actually wrote with the intention of having it published straight away. Because of its importance in that respect, it's pretty much the only, well, no, it's not the only work of Pepys that's always been in print, but it still is in print. Pretty much the only time I'm ever going to get a co-author credit with Samuel Pepys. Yeah, and it's a very, very interesting book because, again, there's a lot of emphasis these days on things like image management and reputation management. And Pepys was an absolute master of this. And what this book is intended to do is to compare him and the periods when he was the Secretary to the Admiralty, 1673 to 79 and 1684 to 89, with the periods around that. So with the parliamentary commissioners who came in between 79 and 84, and then with the parliamentary commissioners who came in from 89 onwards. And let me show you an example of the way in which Pepys goes about his mission. Here are the figures that Pepys gives in this book for the state of the Royal Navy at various times. So August 1678, as you can see, lots of big numbers there. April 1679, still some pretty big numbers. And that's about a month before he ceases to be Admiralty Secretary. May 1684, when the interim commission is dissolved and he comes back, you get the figures there, and in October 1688, there. So it all looks absolutely clear-cut, doesn't it? Absolutely conclusive. Pepys good, everybody else bad. Except that this is all complete fiction. The numbers aren't fiction, but the way Pepys has manipulated them is very fictional, to say the least, or at least it's turned it into that. In August 1678, if you notice, I haven't put at sea in brackets, because Pepys is giving the entire Navy, including all the ones in harbour. In April 1679, yes, that number of ships were at sea, and that's very impressive. They were only at sea because they'd been mobilised the year before for a French war, which never happened, and the government didn't have the money to pay them off. But Pepys has used that set of numbers to contrast with the May 1684 numbers and say, weren't his successors terrible and incompetent, and look how tiny the fleet is. Except the numbers in May 84 are wrong. The number that they actually had at sea was nearly double that. And in any case, that would be the normal number, or something like the normal number you would expect to be at sea during any given May in peacetime. So Pepys, with the 79 and 84 figures, has basically contrasted a wartime figure, effectively, with a peacetime figure. It's a con. It's a blatant con. Fake news, as they say. And in October 1688, what's happening in October 1688? There happens to be quite a large Dutch fleet being mobilised on the other side of the North Sea, and the English fleet, in turn, has been mobilised to protect against that. So, of course, there's a bigger fleet at sea in the autumn of 1688. Pepys has presented the figures without any context whatsoever. He's compared fish and donkeys. So, yes. The other factor in relation to the Navy in the period given there, from 78 to 88, pretty much all that 10-year period, is that there was a colossal building program underway in parallel with the ships that were actually at sea. Because in 1677, with the threat from France's naval expansion really worrying Charles and even Parliament, money was voted for 30 new ships. There's the launch of the first of them, the Lennox, in a picture by my friend Richard Enser, who spoke in the conference on Saturday. And The 30 new ships are a particularly controversial part of Pepys's book, his Memoirs of the Royal Navy. There's some quite famous quotes in there, and this is probably the most famous of the lot. Many of the 30 new ships seem not to have been once graved nor brought into dock since they were launched, their hulls not cleaned or aired, but for want of gratings and opening, their hatches and scuttles suffered to heat and moulder, till I have with my own hands gathered toadstools growing in the most considerable of them, as big as my fists. The defect should have been rectified upon the ordinary estimate of the Navy that provides for everything needful to the preservation of ships in harbour, but more especially for the graving 1/3 of the whole every year, whereas some, even of the old ships in brackets, and I've emphasised that for a reason, appear not to have been looked after in 5 or 6. Now, where was the Gloucester all of this time? The Gloucester was there in Portsmouth Dockyard. And if you look just there, that is the dry dock of Portsmouth Dockyard, the stern of a ship there. She had been under repair in Portsmouth Dockyard from May 1678 until August 1680, so just over 2 years, which seems incredible. And certainly wasn't what anybody wanted, because it's a double dry dock. There's another ship further up the dry dock, which you can't get out while the Gloucester is in there for all this time. So it's a bit of an issue, to say the least. Now, let me just check what the next slide is. No, that's right. Okay. So she is there for a very long time. Does this suggest that there is something very incompetent going on in the naval administration? Well, on one level, you can argue that. There is certainly a shortage of money. There are plenty of letters where the commissioner at Portsmouth, Sir Richard Beach, is appealing for more money. But if you know anything about Sir Richard Beach, you'll know that he's not just a glass half empty sort of person, he's a what's a glass sort of person. He is one of the most negative and pessimistic individuals you will come across in the 17th century. Just because Sir Richard Beach is complaining about something doesn't mean it's necessarily so. So, the point is that the Gloucester, when it comes out finally after those more than 2 years in the dry dock, isn't in one of the worst conditions of any ship in the Navy. It's in one of the best. And this is probably why it's chosen for such an important voyage in 1682. Think back to Pepys's emphasis, even the old ships. It's counterintuitive, but in that time, they often preferred to use the old ships because they knew they were more reliable. It's a bit like people of my era, and certainly my father, going on about running in a new car. That was the problem with those of the 30 new ships that had already been built. They were brand new, which is why they don't trust any of them with something like the voyage the Gloucester went on. And the Warspite, which succeeds Gloucester in that dry dock, survives, and it's got various rebuilds and so on, which are a bit of a con as a system. It survives until 1679, and I've just broken the clicker, but there you go. These things happen. Let's bring it back to the Henry, the loss of the Henry 10 days later. If you actually look, though, at the list of accidental warship losses per year, 1682 is not an exceptional year. It's just a complete coincidence. There are 3 losses there. The other one is actually about a month later in the Caribbean. And that's all it is. It's a complete coincidence, not proof of some deeper incompetence or corruption in the naval administration, that these 2 ships go at the same time. The Henry blew up because a very old sailor who was on board her, this was in harbour, she was in what was called in ordinary, so she had just a maintenance crew on. In those days, it was like a kind of a floating care home. Because you gave positions on these ships in ordinary to old sailors and old officers as a kind of almost a pension. So a really old seaman on the Henry knocked over a candle, bang, well, not bang as such, but it certainly burned the ship out and lost it. So, the state of the Navy, yes, there was a shortage of money, but the Admiralty Commission of 1679 to 84 was in many respects perfectly competent. They've got a huge problem with getting money out of the Treasury, but they are pushing the right sort of ideas, the right sort of policies at the time, and the Gloucester is one of the best ships in the Navy at that particular moment. Of course, that in a way is all somewhat academic, because in, whoops, wrong one, there we go. In 1684, following the exclusion crisis, following the defeat of the exclusionists and those who wanted to kick James out from the succession, James and Pepys return. Pepys actually comes back in a much more exalted position, a French-style Minister of State, in fact. And then, of course, he sets about putting together all this information and writing this book that will trash everybody else until the present day. James, of course, within a few months, is king when Charles dies. The child, incidentally, of him and Mary of Modena was born. It was a girl, and it lived for 2 months. But of course, this is one of the things, as was said in the conference, about the loss of the Gloucester. There are so many tantalizing what-ifs. You know, what if James had been killed on her? What if the child had been a boy and lived? So, add all those things in. Anyway, I think that is pretty much my time. So, thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you, David. That was brilliant. Our second speaker is Professor Andrew Lambert. Andrew was born and raised in Norfolk, and he is currently Loughton Professor of Naval History in the Department of War Studies at King's College London, and he is Director of the Lawton Naval History Unit. His work focuses on British naval, strategic and cultural history between the Napoleonic Wars and the First World War, the evolution of naval historical writing and the history of technology. And he's made several television documentaries. His books, the list of books is amazing. I will just give you some highlights. He's written a book on the Crimean War, a book on Nelson, a book on Franklin and polar navigation, but his 2 most recent books have done extraordinarily well in terms of winning awards. He's won the Anderson Medal from the Society for Nautical Research. He has also won the Gilder Learman Prize for Military History and the British and others. So his most recent book is called Sea Power States, Maritime Culture, Continental Empires, and the Conflict that has shaped the modern world. He's working on 2 more books currently, and today he's going to speak to us on James, Duke of York, Soldier, Admiral, and King, a study in failure. Andrew.
Many thanks for that kind introduction, Claire. It's such a pleasure to be able to speak on home turf. Although I ply my trade in London, I still have my heart in this county. I was born not far from here in the hospital. I was a difficult child. James II, James Duke of York, the King, is a controversial figure. And I would like to argue that what we're seeing in the Gloucester accident, failure, is indicative of a flaw in his character. He was accused of many things, but I think in moments of crisis, he was occasionally prone to dithering, and it would cost him more than just the loss of a ship and a few lives. James has had a very bad press. If you read most of the classic histories of Britain, he's a very bad king, primarily because he was a Catholic, but he was also quite a bad man, and he has been sidelined. In the history of the Royal Navy, he is a blip. And in some ways, that's perfectly correct. He commanded the fleet at sea on 2 occasions. But I would argue that he commanded the fleet at sea with commendable skill, attention, and outstanding courage, and did something that most British admirals didn't manage to do, which was to defeat the Dutch in battle. In 1846, the First Lord of the Admiralty, Edward Law, 2nd Earl of Ellenborough, who'd just taken over the office, proposed that a well-known statue of James by Grinling Gibbons, the great sculptor of the age, should be put in the forecourt of the Admiralty building on Whitehall, so that everybody coming into the building, and indeed passing on Whitehall, could see the man who had made the modern Royal Navy. The Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel, had very different political antenna, and he decided that this was not possible. Anti-Catholic legislation had only just been revoked. Catholic legislation put in place after James abandoned the country in 1688. And with an Irish crisis very much at the centre of British political tension, the very last thing the Prime Minister wished to do was to raise the spectre of England's last Catholic king. It was a wise decision. 2 years later, Thomas Babington Macaulay launched his definitive Whig version of English history, in which he cast James as the villain of the piece. This was the story of a liberal political party who created their own history, and they changed Britain by privileging themselves, getting rid of royal absolutism, and making sure the working classes had no share in political power. This version would dominate the way English history was written. It turned James into a caricature. I would like to argue that there's more to James than caricature, and there's more indeed than serving in the Royal Navy or indeed being king. In 1651, the Stuart court, which had been expelled from the country, took up residence in Paris. James was then just old enough to start a career, and as a prince of the blood, the only career open to him was one in military service. In a very short order, in fact, by the age of 21, he was a lieutenant general in the French army and thought of as a promising rising star in the military field. He was picked out not just by his cousin Louis XIV, but also by the greatest soldier of the age, Marshal Turenne, who was the dominant figure in the early years of Louis XIV's military glory. James had made his name, and he was the poster boy of the royalist exiles in the 1650s, not his elder brother. He was leading, in many cases, English troops in battle alongside the French against the Spanish. And then everything changed, and he was obliged to join the Spanish army and fight the French. And it was at this battle, the Battle of the Dunes, there's the North Sea, and Dunkirk is just in there, where James had the mortifying experience of being driven off the field by Commonwealth troops. His own English troops were not able to hold the field. The Spanish army collapsed, and he was very critical of their professionalism. And I think that's a point I want to emphasize. This man is a professional soldier for a decade in the greatest army on earth, and he brings that with him into the job of running the Royal Navy. When it becomes the Royal Navy and he becomes Lord High Admiral, those are the sensibilities. He wants a navy that works as well as the French army. And funnily enough, he's going to copy the French regulations for naval service because they're quite good. So he's an effective, progressive, and increasingly efficient leader for the Royal Navy down to 1673. And he sustains that connection, as David pointed out, right the way through his period in exclusion. And when he comes to the throne, he really does emphasize that development. He's not just Lord High Admiral, he's also in charge of Dover, of Portsmouth, of the Cinque Ports. These are the defensive keys of the kingdom. He is front and centre to the defence of the island nation. Of course, with Samuel Pepys writing about it, it's difficult to disentangle who did what in this period, other than Mr. Pepys and his somewhat inflated claims, but it's quite clear that James has a commitment to this business, and he continues in that field. He takes the fleet to sea in 1665 in the Second Anglo-Dutch War, and he takes a major role in the battle at Lowestoft on the 1st of June 1665. He is in command. He is the fleet admiral. Let's think about this. He has no prior naval experience in battle. He has not commanded ships in battle, let alone a very large fleet, getting on for 100 ships. And he's not fighting any old enemies. He's fighting the Dutch, who are remarkably good at this line of work. He's fortunate. His opponent, the Dutch Admiral Opdam, is another cavalryman. And as James somewhat ironically pointed out, Admiral Opdam was no seaman. James did what any brave professional leader would do. He took his big capital ship right into the middle of the fighting, and those around him took heavy casualties. The staff that attended him were chopped to pieces, and bits of them were all over James by the end of the battle, including bits of the skull of one of them that penetrated through his hand. And he stood there and he continued to do his job and pressed the action harder and harder, and eventually drove the Dutch off the field in disarray. It was a very successful battle. The Dutch flagship blew up, the Dutch admiral was killed. The Royal Navy had been brought together. And remember, this navy is made up of two different kinds of navy. There are a lot of Commonwealth men in there and some returned royalists. And James court-martialed a junior royalist officer who spoke out against the Commonwealth men. He made it his business to bring the service back together again. This was quite important because the flagship, the Royal Charles, had previously been called the Naseby, named after Cromwell's great victory over Charles I. So his unflinching, courageous leadership sets an example which inspires others to follow in his wake. And in this battle, he's supported by the Earl of Sandwich, former Commonwealth officer, and his cousin Prince Rupert, obviously a royalist. So this is two halves of the English Navy coming together. The Dutch Navy, under pressure, collapses, and the two surviving Dutch admirals sail back to different anchorages. One to the Texel, the other towards Rotterdam, because they are from different admiralties. The Dutch fleet is not just beaten, they're broken by this experience. Charles quickly realized that his heir was now highly vulnerable. All of his staff had been killed or wounded. It was probably a good idea that he didn't command the fleet next time out. He was dragged ashore, and command was left, as it turned out, to men who were less capable. And the next season saw battles not go so well for the English. In 1672, when the Third War breaks out, James is once again in command, and he commands at Sole Bay when the fleet is attacked by Michiel de Ruyter, the great Dutch admiral, perhaps the greatest fighting sailor of the 17th or indeed the 18th century. This is James's proudest boast, I would suggest, that he managed not to be defeated by de Ruyter. Very few people managed to avoid that fate. In this battle, Norfolk-born John Narborough, one of the captains on his flagship, noted that James went about the ship and cheered the men to fight. That's exactly what Nelson did before Trafalgar. He used his presence, any charisma that he had, and he clearly had some, to cheer the men up and get them to do their duty and set them an example. Where the admiral and the captain stand on a fighting sailing ship is the most dangerous place you could possibly stand. Everybody knows who you are, where you are, and you don't have any protection. You are setting a very brave example, and you're almost certainly going to be killed or wounded. The Duke thought himself never near enough to the enemy, for he was ever calling to the quartermaster, which conned the ship, to love her nearer. Give me commands to forbear firing until we got up close to them. Between 9 and 10 o'clock, Sir John Cox was slain with a great shot, being close to the Duke on the poop. Several gentlemen and others were slain or wounded. This is really messy stuff. The flagship is breaking through the enemy's formation and it's fighting for its survival. This is the second flagship of the Earl of Sandwich, which is hit by a Dutch fire ship and is consumed. So you could be blown up in these battles quite easily. Narborough was enormously impressed by the Duke's conduct, by his expertise. He is better acquainted in these seas than many masters which are now in this fleet. We might question that when we get onto the Gloucester. Perhaps he wasn't quite as well acquainted. During the battle, the flagship was disabled. He moved his flag to another flagship. And when that was disabled, he moved his flag to a third flagship so he could continue the action, not withdraw from it, not be left behind. He made it his business to press the battle towards a conclusion. Right? The chief pilot of the fleet was killed standing alongside the Duke on the third flagship that he boarded. They fought off a Dutch attack despite the French not giving them the support they had promised. In 1673, James issued a new set of printed sailing and fighting instructions to give more control to the admiral over the fleet. He was trying to run the navy like an army. And in the tactical sense, this is important. Admiral Sir Charles Penrose, 140 years later, and Penrose was a very smart officer towards the end of the Napoleonic Wars, I quote, "It is but justice to remark that they displayed a very considerable degree of nautical skill and must, at the time when they were first issued, have been a very superior code of tactics, highly creditable to their royal author, who was indeed a much better admiral than he proved to be as a monarch." And I would back Sir Charles Penrose on that. I think he was indeed absolutely right. So James provides firm and effective leadership to the Navy ashore and afloat. He brings the Navy together. Where are these people coming from? They're coming from both sides, naval and in the civil service. Who is Mr. Pepys? Which side was he on during the Commonwealth? Right? He's part of the Commonwealth team. He's taken on board and he becomes integral to the system. So James commands the fleet on 2 occasions. He hardly has a moment to get his skill set up before he's engaged in life and death battle with some outstanding opponents, and he does exceptionally well. I don't think anybody else would have done any better on the day, and that includes officers who've been in the Navy an awful lot longer than he had. I think his ability to do that is highly commendable. Admirals with a lifetime of experience often did significantly worse than James did. This is the self-image of the king, and here, of course, is his flagship, the Royal Prince, from the 1672 campaign. He's dressed as the Roman god Mars. This is a very stylized picture. I'm sure he didn't wear these clothes, but these are the clothes of a Roman god. Right? And it would be said of Nelson, after the Battle of the Nile, that he too had become a Roman god and is remembered on top of a Roman pillar in the middle of London. Henri Gascard, French artist, is absolutely giving us the full treatment. Similar pictures exist of Louis XIV, but not with any naval glory in the background. Louis was not up for naval glory at all. That was not his thing, as we will see. So James is projecting himself as the dynamic military figure. This is part of his claim for the throne. English warrior prince. This is the Henry V thing. This is Edward III. This is how you make your claim. In 1682, he doesn't make his mind up. There's a crisis. He reacts slowly. He's indecisive. He doesn't, and I think that's a pattern. Is it failure of nerve or decision? I'm not sure, but it's absolutely clear that he is not capable of making those quick and effective decisions when he's got options. In those 2 great battles, he doesn't have any choices. If he's going to do his job properly, he has to press on. It's pretty simple. Here, he has choices. Do we leave the ship? Don't we? What's the best way ahead? So I think he's paralyzed by having too much opportunity to decide. It's also, before we dispose of this, worth remembering that James is the single most important patron of the imported Dutch marine artists who will create English marine art. English pictures of the sea are Flemish and Dutch in origin, and the Van der Velders who are painting the great pictures, they are bought over like expensive football players from Holland to improve your scoring rate in terms of culture. The Rag of the Gloucester, indecision. Ambition, indecision. something goes wrong, what do we do? So James, I think, reveals something of the flaws that will see him lose his throne later in the decade. In 1685, he becomes king, and in his first speech from the throne, he gives us the following lines. I think it's something that could be read out in Parliament today. I quote, "I must recommend to you the care of the navy, the strength and glory of this nation, that you will put it into such a condition as will make us considered and respected abroad." £400,000 a year means that indeed the fleet is going up and it will be respected abroad. The problem is it will not be led by the best men. English naval administration is efficient, fairly honest, and it's developing a very powerful battle fleet. James is using that fleet. He is not sharing that with Parliament. Parliament pays the bills, James directs the fleet. That will all change after 1688. In 1688, the Dutch invasion comes, and the response to that reflects, I think, James's indecision, and I think he loses his throne because he can't make his mind up what to do next. He appoints the Earl of Dartmouth to command the fleet, who is not really fit for purpose. Dartmouth is not an officer with a successful track record. He's there because he will put up with James's religious reforms, where most of the senior officers will not. Indeed, the Dutch fleet is not led by a Dutch admiral, it's led by an English admiral, Arthur Herbert, who has gone over to the other side. Dartmouth anchors in the gun fleet, one of the shoals in the Thames estuary, believing the Dutch would land to the north of the Thames, and he's windbound there when the Dutch wind blows and blows the Dutch fleet down the channel to land in Torbay. James had advised Dartmouth to take station off the Dutch coast and prevent the Dutch from sailing. Dartmouth and his Council of War had rejected that advice. The king was a better admiral than his admiral, and he would have been much better if he'd taken command of the fleet himself. He should have put his armour on and gone to sea. Then it would have been a much better competition. William III, his son-in-law and nephew, in those days incest laws were different, was no admiral. He was a successful general, but he was no admiral. Instead, James hesitates, dithered, and allowed his support to ebb away. The Dutch land, James should have put his armour on and led the army. Doesn't do that either. He can't make his mind up what to do. And in the end, that indecision ultimately costs him his throne. There is no battle. He's allowed to leave. Dartmouth lacked the personal authority to command, which James had in spades, and he arrives too late to stop the invasion. There is no attempt to seek a military showdown. James does not fight the battle. The English army drifts across and gives up. The Dutch come in and take over. Louis XIV provided him with a palace, an income, and potentially opportunities to recover his throne. But just think about that. A French army puts you back on the throne of England. How popular are you going to be? And that's leaving aside the Catholic thing. Nobody likes being helped by the French. That's a historical point, rather than. Of course, Louis recognized that James was very useful, so he sent him to Ireland with a French army. Not a very big one, just enough French troops to form a nucleus of an Irish army to take over and open up a new front in the war against William III. But of course, James does exactly what he does in the case of the Gloucester, the Battle of the Boyne. He has an army, he's in a position, he doesn't exercise any leadership, he allows the battle to drift away from him. One wonders what is going on here. He seems to have lost the thing that had made him so successful as an admiral: decision, commitment. And eventually, as William advances, William has very good field commanders who actually fight his battle for him. James is defeated. And all the way through this campaign, he's conflicted. He's an English patriot fighting against the Anglo-Dutch army with a Franco-Irish army. He is deeply conflicted by this, and he lets the French know this. When some English ships are driven off by the French, he said, it's only because they respect me and know I'm on board that they're not engaging. They would otherwise have defeated you very easily. The French have never beaten the English at sea fighting. He lost the Battle of the Boyne, retreats to France. Weeks later, the French won a major naval battle off Beachy Head. A crisis, perhaps an invasion could happen, but the French are not ready with an army and nothing happens. The irony of that battle, of course, is that the English fleet fought using fighting instructions which still bore the name of James, Duke of York. So it was his navy, using his orders and his methods, that managed to avoid being wiped out in that battle. 2 years later, King Louis decides to invade England. He's finally ready to send a Franco-Irish army to recover the kingdom and take William III out of the equation of the Great European War. But the Royal Navy of England and the Dutch allies, led by men that James had trained, stood in his way. Off Cape Barfleur on the 19th of May, 1692, the Dutch and English outnumber the French and hammer them and drive them out of the Channel. The French Atlantic fleet has been heavily defeated. Their Mediterranean squadron has not arrived in time to support them, and a relentless pursuit turns the French retreat into a rout and then into a catastrophe. At Saint-Vaast-la-Hougue, on May 23rd, English ships pull into the harbour. Their boats attack the French ships. The previous day, the French flagship, the Soleil Royal, had been caught aground at Cherbourg and burnt by English boats, along with 2 other great French ships. The bonfire of Louis XIV's ambitions had begun. At Saint-Vaast, 7 battleships were destroyed, again by boat, by men in boats. This was captured by Dutch artists for English patrons. These are English pictures, but they're painted by Dutchmen to celebrate the end of the great threat of the French invasion. This is an art that is celebrating victory. James had advised the French to put troops on their ships that were aground to defend them against incoming English boats. He knew what the English would do because it was his fleet. Admiral Tourville, the French commander, declared it would be a dishonour to commit the defence of his ships to soldiers, and he refused. And shortly afterward, they were burnt. French sailors were not as disciplined as French soldiers in those days. On the 23rd, something very strange happened. As the French ships were set on fire, they started bombarding the coast. The guns were still loaded. As they burnt, the guns loosed off, and the rounds that they were loaded with crashed into the shore. Several rounds crashed into the fort where James II had been standing a few minutes earlier. He could well have been killed by friendly fire under the most unusual of circumstances. Despite all of this, he could not resist cheering his sailors on. That's the English sailors. He declared to an assembly of French admirals, marshals and generals, I quote, "None but my brave English could do so brave an action." Talk about tactless. When it came to naval warfare and religion, James preferred the simple truth to sparing the feelings of his fellows. He wouldn't compromise on his mass to be the king, and he wouldn't compromise on the truth about naval warfare to pander to the French. His audience, it seems, were either too polite or too gobsmacked to actually think of a response. It was a singularly inappropriate comment by a man who had a habit of making verbal gaffes. When the sun went down on 24th of May 1692, Louis XIV's hopes of winning this war were over, and so was the personal ambition of James II. The troop transports were burnt the next day, and if you go to Saint-Vaast-la-Hougue to this day, you will find some excellent moules et frites, and the moules are growing on the wrecks of Louis XIV's battle fleet. I find them very tasteful. James would spend the rest of his life in a palace on the outskirts of Paris, Saint-Germain-en-Laye, a rather scruffy, beaten-up palace, not a suitable place for an ex-English king to live. James abandoned earthly ambition for a life of religious introspection. He attributed his downfall to the withdrawal of God's favour on account of his womanizing and other bad behaviour. He abjured all earthly pleasures for the rest of his life, subjecting his flesh to the torments of chains and scourges. Had he possessed the self-knowledge to tell the truth, he would have seen that his fall was caused by the avowal of a faith that his sailors and most of his people had been taught to abhor. Instead, James redirected his propaganda, replacing the image of an English warrior prince with a penitent saint, seeking to redeem himself through his personal sacrifice and just hoping he could recover the throne for his son. Thank you very much.
David, can I invite both you and Andrew to come and join me at the front, because we have some time for questions.
Splendid.
And because of your perfect timing, we have the full half hour. So if there are either questions online or questions from the room, I would be delighted to take them now.
Great.
Yes, there will be a microphone that just comes. Is this gentleman just here?
When Pepys published the book, which you said had the misleading data in it, was he publishing that as an individual, or was he publishing that in his role at the Admiralty, and how would his superiors or the government have viewed that, really?
Yeah, it's as a private individual. He'd left office by then. Because what happened was, as Andrew alluded to, the start of the naval war against the French in 1689 and then into 1690 didn't go well at all. And I think from memory that the book is published, it's certainly after the Battle of Beachy Head in 1690, where, of course, you know, the performance of the English fleet was so bad, and the result was certainly not what the country expected or wanted. So what Pepys is doing is, in the light of all of that, he is trying to say, well, this has happened because the wrong people are in charge. The wrong people were in charge previously as well, and the Navy is absolutely fine when I'm in charge. So, I mean, it's very, very blatant in many respects, and it is slightly surprising, perhaps, that historians and writers generally have bought this or bought it for much of the time. Certainly if you read Sir Arthur Bryant's famous trilogy about Samuel Pepys, you know, he has swallowed all this hook, line and sinker. So yes, I mean, it's as a private individual, but there's a greater blurring at that time between private and public. And a classic example of that is that just before that book was published in the previous year, Pepys, when he left office, took the main papers of the Admiralty, the letter books, with him. He regarded them as his private property. So, you know, this whole idea of professionalism and so on that we're used to in regard to civil service, it was very, very different in Pepys's day.
Yeah. It's worth reflecting that Pepys is essentially creating a new genre, which we would call naval history, as part of the promotional material for selling this idea we need the very large navy, and of course that we need Mr. Pepys to run it. So it's very much a book with two agendas. I think by 1690 the main agenda is personal, but he's spent much of his adult life collecting material, legitimately and illegitimately, to write the history of the Navy. And if you go to Magdalen College in Cambridge, you will find that it's still in the book presses where he put it. This is the great unwritten book of late Stuart England. Pepys doesn't write it. His friend John Evelyn is also writing, and they're both talking about doing this. They never get round to it. So there's a failure of delivery here. They wouldn't get a ref point for this, would they? Yeah. Sorry, in joke, sorry.
Thank you. Jared has a question.
I've managed to get hold of the microphone here, so it would be more of a question for Andrew. I was kind of struck by how you were talking about how James was very much a competent and energetic person in terms of the running of the Navy and in earlier days in the Army. And afterwards, following the exclusion crisis and indeed the sinking of the Gloucester, there were events in which he was much less committed, so to say, to the battles within the Navy and very indecisive. What I'd be wondering is just how much you think things like the sinking of the Gloucester would have affected his mindset, especially in terms of, as we know, he became a penitent in his later years, and how this would have affected his handle his effectiveness as a commander, and indeed how well he was able to or how well he wasn't able to manage the glorious revolution that came soon after.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. That's a very good question. Would he have been a more effective king in 1688 if the Gloucester disaster hadn't happened? It's a very interesting idea. Right? So the performance he puts up in 1688 is remarkably like the performance he puts up in 1682. Indecisive, unwilling to commit, not prepared to take responsibility. It's almost exactly opposite to the performance he puts up in the two great sea battles and in his leadership of the Navy in the earlier period of Charles II's reign. So perhaps there is something happening here. Perhaps we are looking at a career of two halves, to use another analogy, that he loses that sense of invincibility which he had previously. One might suspect that his profound change of his religious views might have had an impact there. Or maybe they're all connected. Maybe he's losing faith in himself and he's looking for faith somewhere else. He certainly is somebody who looks for leadership. The way he writes about being in the French army and serving under Marshal Turenne, it's quite clear that this is something that is galvanizing him. Having the imprimatur of someone of Turenne's caliber and status certainly transforms him, and it makes this 18 to 21-year-old prince into a very effective military commander. So I think and not having that perhaps later on, I think he needed some guidance, and perhaps he's looking for it in the wrong place, because I'm not sure that the Pope is going to give you good tips on tactics at sea.
Thank you. I think we've got a question towards the front, please.
Yeah.
Lady at the front.
So I was fortunate enough to attend a previous event which was talking about the drinking culture. So I was just wondering whether you thought that could have had any impact to the decisions that were made, because there were so many wine bottles found, and whether that could have had an effect. Was it a party ship?
Well, Claire knows a lot more about the wine bottles than I do, but I mean, I think there is quite a lot of evidence, shall we say, that they are certainly having a very, very good time on the Gloucester. She's sailing up there, and why wouldn't they? It's debatable, I don't know. I mean, I can't think off the top of my head of any particular evidence to suggest that, James Ayres, the pilot, and the rest of them were particularly sozzled at the time. I mean, I think it's very unlikely that James himself was, because one thing that he and Charles, his brother, had in common was that they were both pretty temperate men. So, I don't know. I mean, I think it's an interesting question. I don't think one would ever be able to answer, no matter how many more bottles that they find in the shipwreck.
Yeah, I think what's interesting there is the timing. It is very early in the morning, so who's going to be on deck? Not the obvious candidates. So the course has been set. Everybody who matters has turned in for the night and has left the officer of the watch in charge. And the officer of the watch doesn't have a great deal of authority. They're not going to change course in the middle of the night without summoning senior authority. And nobody wants to wake the Duke of York up in the middle of the night. So I think it's an accident that has many factors, and we don't have the full set of evidence as to exactly how it unfolds. But if you look at the timing, there may have been some slightly bleary-eyed, hungover people involved, but certainly not James. I would agree with David. The two royal brothers had many faults, but that wasn't one of them.
I mean, one thing as well that, of course, Ayres is suspected of being a Republican, because you're now into the backlash that whereas in the early stages, 78, 79, 80, it's very much the Catholics who are seen as the evil conspiracy that's trying to destroy the state. By 82, it has turned around. And so that's why this theory that Ayres might have been trying in a very bizarre and clumsy way, and not a terribly sensible way, to kill the Duke of York as a Republican plotter, why that gained some traction. And I think certainly that was suggested, but the idea that, he and the others on the Gloucester were drunk or hungover is never really mooted.
I'm going to invoke chair's privilege here and ask both of you a question. And at the beginning of the session, we talked about that in our exhibition, we have a choice that we invite our visitors to make of who is the most responsible for the tragedy of the Gloucester. And we offer 4 alternatives. So we offer the pilot, James Ayres, who at 4 o'clock in the morning goes to bed at 5:30, the Gloucester strikes. The pilot is saying they're past all danger. We offer Captain Christopher Gunman, captain of the Mary yacht, who sailing ahead knows that they're in shallow water and orders flags to be waved rather than a gun to be fired. We offer James, Duke of York, and Andrew is saying he's indecisive, but is his indecisiveness about not leaving the ship quickly, and actually he'd been rather too decisive the night before in the arguments when the different alternatives were offered, and he's saying no, we're going straight through. And we offer the sandbank, we offer the natural disaster. I don't know whether you've had chance to vote yet, but may I ask you for your from those alternatives, or perhaps another, who do you think is most responsible for the Gloucesters, the depth of the tragedy?
My vote goes to the sandbank. These things move. This isn't a period when we do not have accurate, reliable charts for all of the coast. It's local knowledge. It's some individuals' expertise. It's at night, so do you know exactly where you are on a 17th century ship at night? Can you see the coastal lights? And if so, what coastal lights can you see? There is no lighthouse. There are no navigational beacons out there. There is no GPS. There is no running chart. You cannot say, okay, we're right here, precise fix, and there's a sandbank ahead. We think there's sort of a sandbank somewhere in that kind of 25, 30 degree sway, but we know that they move. So I think the sandbank is at fault here. It has moved into the path of the ship. Not on the evening, but it has certainly the local expertise was that this was safe. The pilot's comments are quite clear. He believed it was safe. I suspect he was telling the truth, that was safe, but it is no longer safe. So I think what we're looking at is an accident caused by the limited knowledge of coastal features, and particularly underwater features. That would be my...
I'll concur with Andrew on that, because this is a very, very well-frequented sea area. And again, James, for example, knew this area well. They all did. Ayres and Gunman, they were East Coast men, and they knew these seas. So it should have been a very, very straightforward voyage, which is possibly why all the wine is there. But I blame the sandbank too.
Thank you.
So the locals get the final vote. It's a Norfolk sandbank.
We've got a question at the back, towards the back.
Yeah.
It's okay? Yeah.
Yes.
I was interested, just as an aside, interested in the last answer, because my subject is the Titanic, and at exhibitions you put up to people, was it Captain Smith, was it the company, and in the end most people say it was the iceberg. In the same way with the sandbank. Well, the question, I may have missed this, or my dates may be wrong, but did Samuel Pepys ever comment on the loss of the Gloucester?
Not in detail.
He would have been aware of it, presumably.
Yeah, oh, well, he's on the yacht. He's on the Mary yacht, going up there as well. And of course he does eventually get there. It's the one and only time that he goes to Scotland. So yeah, I mean, Pepys was a witness in some respects. But of course the great tragedy, and again, what might have been of English history, he'd stopped writing his diary in 1669, if only he was still writing his diary at the time. and we had his first-hand account. Having said that, I don't know how useful his first-hand account would be, given that he's not on the Gloucester. He's on a ship that survives.
Yeah.
He should have been on the Gloucester. He swaps with Baron Dartmouth to one of the yachts. And he does write from Edinburgh to assure his friends back in London that he's safe. Yeah. So that's one of the big things is that the news of the disaster is going to travel so quickly that everybody that survived doesn't want their friends and family to think that they the depth of the tragedy is huge, and they don't want so letters need to go as quickly as possible. So he does write, as David says, a brief account. I think we had Peter first, so we need the microphone to come down first, and we'll go in order if we don't. It's just at the front here. Thank you.
Just thinking about the nature of command and the idea of who was responsible for the wreck, we seem to have missed out, in my view, somebody else who was in the argument and who seems to have been sidelined in all this, which is the captain of the Gloucester, John Berry. Now, obviously, he had the Duke of York breathing over his neck and was probably not going to say, look, you're talking rubbish. But was it the case that the captains already had ultimate responsibility for his ship, whoever was on it? Or was that really an idea that only came later? And if it was the case, should John Berry not bear some responsibility for being responsible for knowing where his ship was?
It's a good point. I mean, I think this whole question about who's in command is, of course, the problem. Berry is the captain of the ship. James has no official position. He's the Lord High Admiral of Scotland, but not of England. But of course, he is the Duke of York, he's the King's brother, he is the heir to the throne. So whatever the naval chain of command is, that is arguably superseded by the monarchical chain of command, as you like. And Berry was very much one of the Duke of York's men. He had been promoted, his career had been advanced by the Duke from the beginning. John Berry starts out as a bosun of a ketch in the East Indies. Sorry, West Indies. He is, a very small fry. James spots his talent, gets him promoted, and so on. Berry is likely to defer to the man who's promoted him throughout his career.
Question at the back. Oh, sorry. Again, if we might go in. There's a gentleman that's been waiting. Come back.
I think it's an interesting debate to have who's at fault for the tragedy, but from a naval perspective, it's also when something goes wrong, who's in command and how they react to it. That's how they'll be judged by the other sailors, by the passengers, ultimately by the society. Sometimes when things go wrong, people can't always apportion the blame. It's also then how the captain, how whoever's in charge of the ship reacts to the fact that something's gone wrong. And I suppose what they prioritise, who they prioritise that they get off the ship, how quickly they do it. Just to throw a point out there.
I think there's an interesting point here. James shifted his flagship twice in 1672 because the ship was damaged and he wished to continue the action. He doesn't do that on this occasion, and the strong suggestion is that had he abandoned the ship earlier, other people may well have been able to get off. I don't think there were enough boats available to get everybody off. And obviously there's a priority on getting James off because of his rank and his significance in the royal succession. I think that failure to make his mind up early and take that advice and abandon ship may have cost lives. But I suspect he was also looking at this in terms of not running away, showing leadership. He is, after all, the ex-Lord High Admiral of England. He still has a Scottish rank, and he's coming back into public life. He doesn't want this to be a PR disaster. So he's trying, I suspect, to work out how to do this best without it looking like what it turns out to be, which is a first-class disaster in both senses. Yeah. So I think he's paralyzed. How do I do? What do I do? What's the right answer? In those battles, the right answer is very clear. You get in close to the enemy and continue fighting. That's simple. This isn't simple, and he waits too long before he does the inevitable, which is to abandon ship. Yeah.
Thank you. Lady at the front.
You were mentioning the Battle of Lowestoft. I can't remember exactly which date that was. And presumably, you don't really choose where you're going to have that battle. You suddenly engage, and presumably you try to be in deep enough waters so that nobody will run aground. And presumably James would have known all of that, both the coast quite far out where that battle had taken place, as well as all the local knowledge that provided a very good idea of how shallow it was from the land. But so would his captains of not only the Mary Rose, but the boat that he was on. Mm-hmm. So it raises several questions in my mind as to why they actually did take the decisions that they did take in the end.
Okay. Although it's called the Battle of Lowestoft, and this applies to all the battles we've been talking about, it's not actually immediately off the beach in Lowestoft. Lowestoft is just a kind of convenient name that is stuck onto this. You know, it was quite a long way out in the North Sea, as these battles tended to be. Sol Bay is a bit of an exception because the Anglo-French fleet's at anchor and the Dutch come in to attack it while it's at anchor. So it's actually in the open sea where these questions about, you know, potentially being in shallow water and so on don't really apply. They do in the Third War when they're fighting more in shallow Dutch coastal waters. The key thing in naval battles in this period is to have the advantage of the wind. And your position, in a sense, is dictated by where the wind is, not by what's the name of the nearest town and so on. So that was the key thing. And, you know, that was a lot of the time in the battles of this era is spent manoeuvring to try to gain that advantage long before any firing starts. And James had actually proved himself reasonably good in that particular respect. I don't know what you think on that, Andrew.
It's worth noting that in the great battle in 1666, the year after Lowestoft, one of the English flagships runs aground and is lost as a result of that. It's captured and burnt by the Dutch. So it's an occupational hazard. The North Sea does have seriously dangerous shallows that they do move, and these things are not known. David is right. You need to have the wind at your disposal in order to make that attack. And James seems to have understood that. This is not something that most cavalrymen manage. And his point about the Dutch admiral at Lowestoft, Van Opdam, he is a cavalryman, and unlike James, he hasn't adjusted his understanding of his business. The great thing about being a cavalryman is you've got at least one sentient being looking out for you, and the smart man in the combination is usually the horse. Whereas on a ship, there are no horses, so you have to make your own mind up. And the English habit of naming sea battles after land features is bizarre. When we get to the Battle of Jutland in 1916, the English name it after a Danish peninsula. The Germans call it the Skagerrak after the sea area in which it's fought. It's actually, the German name is much more accurate than the British one. Land features is convenient shorthand. You can find it on the map. So it's got to be somewhere around the Lowestoft kind of area. But it's certainly not that close. The people of Lowestoft might have heard it, but they probably wouldn't have seen it.
Gentleman in the middle.
Yes, thank you. This is mainly for Andrew, but please, David, do chip in. So I'm interested in what you said about James II's vacillation, if you like, his tendency to do that towards the end of his career. And you might contrast that, I guess, with William of Orange's pretty ruthless decisiveness. I think there's quite a lot of evidence for that. So I'm wondering to what extent that contrast plays a role in the Glorious Revolution, but also the fact that, as you said, William of Orange is the nephew and son-in-law of James II. So what role do, if you like, family relations play in the Glorious Revolution? Thank you.
I think there's quite a synergy between James as a young man and William as a young man. But William continues on. William is not a very successful general in terms of winning battles. He wins a minor battle and he captures 2 fortresses in his entire career. The battle he wins is the Boyne, but we know that he has a commander under his authority who's actually managing the tactical battle. William is a strategist. He's the man who understands that Louis XIV is going to conquer Europe if you don't stop him. You can't defeat him, but if you fight his army early in the campaign season, you can do it enough damage so that it doesn't keep moving forward. And he uses a series of essentially defensive, limited battles to stop the French army advancing. That's very clever, because he knows he doesn't have the firepower to defeat the French. 10 years later, the Duke of Marlborough has that firepower, and the Anglo-Dutch army wins those battles. But in William's reign, they don't win the battles, but they fight for a strategic negation of French power. As James gets older, it's quite clear he does become indecisive. He loses that ability to grip the situation, which he'd had as a younger man. The James of 1688 is certainly not the same man who commanded at Solebay. Age or something has taken a toll on his ability to function at that level. Perhaps the responsibilities of being the king may have undermined his resolve. It's a big promotion. I know he's been expecting it for a long time, but it's a big step up. And his brother left some very interesting shoes to fill. James isn't a politician like Charles, but Charles isn't a commander on the field like James. They were well matched as a pair of brothers, but they were not that similar.
I mean, the one rider I'd put to that on this whole question of James's indecisiveness in 1688 is that you read his letters to Dartmouth, and you could say, well, he is being quite decisive. He's saying to Dartmouth, look, put to sea, go out and engage and get on with it. But he's then saying, of course, I'm leaving it to you. And so he's putting Dartmouth, you could argue, in an impossible position. But of course, James is in London, Dartmouth's with the fleet. Dartmouth knows the wind, he knows the sandbanks, he knows the conditions, and so forth. So is this actually good delegation by James? Is it indecisiveness? What is it? Yeah. What's it displaying? It's such a complex, multi-layered situation. I don't think you can stick one label on his thought process and on his actions in 1688.
I think from the start, he's veering towards what he will ultimately do, which is abdicating. I think he's abdicating responsibility, and then he's abdicating the throne to preserve the things that he thinks are really important, which is his son and the succession. Yes. And one wonders who was advising him and whether he thought his faith was more important than his throne. He may well have done. He wouldn't be the first or the last monarch to have those views. So certainly he is not the same man that he had been earlier. We can speculate on what may have changed the way that he saw the world. But that descent towards his death in 1701, when he abandons all earthly ambitions, that I think is very telling. This is a man who's been to the very top, and he's now slipped off the other side. And his ambition from 1692 on is not to get back. It's to make his peace with his God and prepare for what's going to come. So I see him as quite fatalistic. I think in 1688, fatalism may be the thing that brought his reign to an end. He didn't believe they were going to win, and it came to pass because he didn't do anything to stop it.
We are at 7:30. I think it's been an absolutely two fascinating papers and a really tremendous question session. So thank you all so much for being here tonight. May I remind you, on the 20th of June, we have our next session in the series, Shipwreck and the Sea in Early Modern Art and Culture, New Horizons in Watery Graves, and there is some liquid refreshment downstairs. It's certainly not a watery grave, but it will be rather more delightful than that. But before you get to that, may I ask you, in the customary way, to cheer, to whoop, to put your hands together, to say thank you to David and Andrew.
Thank you.